Cold gun oil has a smell that doesn't exist anywhere else in the galaxy, and Marcus Reyes had spent enough of his life around it that he could pick it out of a crowded armory blindfolded, underneath the ozone stink of charge packs and the sterile antiseptic hum of alien maintenance drones. He was field stripping a weapon nobody else on this ship would even call a weapon anymore when the alarm for the Royal Inspection Tour went off 2 decks up. And he didn't hurry, because hurrying with a rifle in pieces on a workbench was how people lost fingers. The rifle in question was a Remington Vance Mark IX Gauss-assisted kinetic rifle, 91 years old, chambered for a 14mm tungsten cord slug that no factory in the Sol Accord had manufactured in 3 decades, handed down to Marcus by his grandfather, who'd carried it through a war nobody outside 3-star systems remembered anymore. It weighed 11 kilos loaded. It had a bolt action that needed to be worked by hand between shots, no autoloader, no smart targeting assist, no energy cell. It was, by every metric the Kintari Dominion's Alliance Procurement Office used to rank equipment garbage. A relic Earth's underfunded auxiliary contingent kept in service, because the budget for proper directed energy small arms had been cut twice in the last decade, and nobody higher up cared enough to fight for it. Marcus loved it anyway, the way you love something that's never once let you down even when everyone around you insists it should have stopped working a long time ago. He had it reassembled and slung across his back by the time he made it topside to the inspection deck, and he was standing at the end of a long line of Earth auxiliary troops, 22 of them, in patched second-hand armor, holding a mix of hand-me-down energy carbines, and in his case, 91 years of dead weight nobody respected. When Princess Vexthala Koronis of the Kintari Dominion walked the line with her honor retinue trailing behind her like a wake. She was tall, pale, violet-skinned, with a crest of fine bone ridges running back from her hairline that caught the deck lighting like polished glass, dressed in ceremonial shield weave that shimmered faintly with the same technology her people had spent 4 centuries perfecting into the most advanced defensive systems in known space. She stopped in front of Marcus, tilted her head at the rifle on his back with an expression of open, undisguised delight, and reached out to tap the barrel with one gloved finger like she was checking whether a museum piece was actually real. "This," she said to her retinue, in the crisp, amused, faintly musical Kintari accent that made even contempt sound like it was set to music, "is what the humans consider a weapon." Nobody answered her, because nobody in the Earth line outranked a princess of the species that had brought them into the Alliance in the first place, and Marcus stood there at attention, jaw tight, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. "It is charming," Vexthala continued, turning the barrel gently so the whole retinue could admire the antique tooling along its receiver, "in the way a museum is charming. Do you know what stops a mass driver slug of this caliber, soldier?" She didn't wait for an answer. "A Class 3 shield array, the sort my own household guards wore 40 years ago as ceremonial equipment before we retired it as insufficient. This weapon could not scratch the shielding on my own honor guard standing 3 meters behind me. It is a wonder your species survived long enough to be granted Alliance membership at all, using instruments like this." "It's kept me alive fine so far, Your Highness," Marcus said, evenly, because it was true, and because he'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in front of someone trying to provoke you was give them the reaction they wanted. Vexthala laughed, a genuine, delighted laugh, bright and musical, and entirely without malice in the way that made it somehow worse than if she'd meant to be cruel, and moved on down the line to inspect the next soldier's equipment, already halfway through forgetting the exchange had happened at all. Marcus stood there a moment longer, feeling the old rifle's weight settle back against his spine, and thought, with the specific tired patience of a man who has been underestimated his entire career, "Laugh now. See how funny it is later." Marcus Reyes had not always been the lowest-ranked human on an Alliance flagship's inspection line. 6 years ago, he'd been a staff sergeant in the Sol Accord's long-range marksmanship division, one of maybe 40 humans across the entire species, with a confirmed record of hitting targets past 2,000 meters without any energy-assisted targeting computer to do the thinking for him. A skill that had been considered vital before the Alliance uplift, and considered a charming anachronism after it, the way most purely human skills got filed once alien technology made the old hard-won competencies look quaint. He'd been demoted 18 months ago for refusing to certify a batch of shield generator components as flight-ready, when his own inspection had found microfractures in the housing that the manufacturer's rep insisted were cosmetic. He'd been right. The components failed catastrophically in testing 2 months later, grounding an entire squadron and costing the manufacturer a contract worth more than Marcus would earn in 3 lifetimes. But by the time the failure proved him correct, he'd already been quietly reassigned off equipment inspection and onto general auxiliary duty, the kind of posting reserved for soldiers whose superiors found them inconveniently insistent on being right about things that were expensive to have been right about. He carried his grandfather's rifle now, not because regulations required it. Regulations, if anything, discouraged it, citing weight allowances and standardization concerns, but because Earth's auxiliary contingent had never actually been issued proper replacement small arms in the 18 months since his demotion, budget cuts eating the request twice in committee, and because some stubborn, quiet part of him refused to carry an unloaded ceremonial rifle, just to satisfy an inspection checklist, when the old Mark IX still put rounds on target better than anything the requisition office had actually managed to deliver. He didn't expect any of that to matter to a Kintari princess, touring an inspection line for a photograph op and a diplomatic courtesy visit. He expected, honestly, that the whole encounter would be forgotten by evening, filed under the long list of small humiliations that came with being part of a species everyone in the Alliance considered useful mostly for cheap manual labor and expendable auxiliary manpower. He did not expect the attack to come less than 40 minutes later. The inspection tour had moved to the flagship's lower observation gallery, a long transparent paneled deck overlooking the shipyard where 3 Alliance capital ships sat in dry dock, when the gallery's outer viewport shattered inward in a shower of reinforced glass and decompression alarms, and the first of the boarders came through the breach in powered armor that shimmered with the distinct, layered shimmer of active shielding. Marcus had never seen Class 5 shielding in person before, only in briefing slides, and even through the chaos of the breach he registered, in the specific detached way trained soldiers process a crisis, that whoever these attackers were, they were carrying equipment that outclassed anything the Kintari Honor Guard themselves were wearing. 6 boarders, then 8, then a dozen, all in matte black armor with no house markings, no Alliance transponder codes, moving with the coordinated precision of professional mercenaries rather than the chaotic aggression of pirates. The Kintari Honor Guard responded exactly the way 4 centuries of doctrine had trained them to respond, plasma carbines up, energy bolts converging on the lead boarders in a crossfire that should have, by every standard the Alliance had operated under for a generation, dropped them where they stood. The bolts hit the shimmering armor and simply dispersed, sheeting off in cascades of harmless light, not one round penetrating, not one boarder so much as staggering from the impact. Fall back. The Honor Guard captain, a broad-shouldered Kintari named Doros Vale who had, 40 minutes earlier, stood next to the princess laughing at Marcus's rifle, shouted the order even as his own carbine bolts scattered uselessly off the nearest boarder's chest plate, and Marcus watched a species that had spent 4 centuries perfecting energy weapons discover, in real time, exactly how useless 4 centuries of doctrine could become the moment someone built a shield tuned specifically to eat that doctrine alive. Vexthala herself stood frozen for one long, terrible second, ceremonial shield weave, doing nothing at all against a physical boarding party. Her retinue scrambling to form a protective ring around her that was buckling under return fire the boarders hadn't even needed to use yet. Because their own weapons, heavy slug throwers, Marcus registered with a jolt of professional recognition, kinetic weapons, the same outdated technology his own rifle used, were clearly considered primitive enough by the Alliance that nobody had bothered shielding against them either, except the boarders' own armor made that irrelevant, because it turned out shields tuned to stop plasma didn't care at all whether you shot back with plasma or with something older. Marcus didn't think. He trained too long for exactly this kind of moment to waste time thinking when thinking cost lives, and his body did what 6 years of long-range marksmanship discipline had built into muscle memory below the level of Concio. Us decision, down on one knee, rifle off his back, bolt worked, sight picture acquired on the lead boarder's helmet seam in under 2 seconds, and squeezed the trigger on a weapon everyone in that gallery except him considered a museum piece. The recoil slammed back into his shoulder hard enough to bruise through his armor padding. The old Mark IX's kick nothing like the negligible pushback of an energy carbine, and the 14mm tungsten cord slug crossed the gallery in a fraction of a second and hit the lead boarder's shielded helmet dead center. The shield didn't disperse the shot in a cascade of harmless light, the way it had every plasma bolt fired at it so far. It punched straight through. The lead boarder dropped in a boneless heap, shield generator sparking and guttering out along his collar in a shower of dying light. And for one full second the entire gallery went silent except for the ringing in Marcus's own ears from the shot. Then everyone started screaming orders at once. "Reload," Marcus muttered to himself, working the bolt with a hand that had gone steady the way it always did once the shooting actually started, the shaking reserved for before and after, never during, and thumbed a fresh round into the chamber from the 6-round internal magazine, while the remaining 11 boarders reoriented toward the one weapon in the gallery that had actually hurt one of them. "That is not possible," Doros Vale said, somewhere behind him, Honor Guard Captain's voice cracking with something that wasn't quite panic yet but was getting there fast. Class 5 shielding is rated to stop kinetic impacts up to 20mm at any velocity, our own doctrine. Your doctrines for slugs moving at the velocities your own weapons fire them at, Marcus said, working the bolt again, sighting on the second boarder as the man raised a heavy slug thrower of his own toward the huddled cluster of retinue around the princess. This thing's a Gauss-assisted mass driver, muzzle velocities north of 2,000 meters a second. Whatever frequency your Class 5 shields are tuned to disperse, it's built around the physics of energy weapons and slow, conventional slugs, not hypervelocity kinetic penetrators. Nobody builds shields against a threat nobody in this alliance still uses. He fired again. The second boarder's shoulder plate shattered inward in a spray of shield light and blood, the man spinning and going down hard, weapon clattering away across the deck. "Get the princess out of the gallery," Marcus called, already working the bolt a third time, sweeping his sight across the remaining 10 boarders now scrambling for cover behind overturned observation consoles. "And somebody get me eyes on how many more of these things are boarding, because 12 is a lot for an inspection tour ambush, and I don't love the math on how many rounds I've got left in this rifle." Nobody argued with him. Doros Vale, 40 minutes removed from laughing at an antique weapon alongside his princess, was already barking orders to the retinue to fall back toward the gallery's inner blast doors, plasma carbines still firing uselessly at shielded armor, because old habits and old doctrine didn't unlearn themselves in the span of 90 seconds, no matter how obviously they just stopped working. Vixthala, for her part, did not run. She stood at the edge of the retreating retinue, staring at Marcus Reyes kneeling behind an overturned bench with a rifle she'd mocked less than an hour ago, watching him drop a third boarder with a shot that punched clean through shielding her own people had spent 4 centuries perfecting, and something in her expression had gone from delighted contempt to a very different, much more urgent kind of attention. "How many rounds?" she said to him directly, voice sharp and clear even over the chaos. "3 left in the mag," Marcus said, working the bolt on an empty chamber and reaching for the spare box of ammunition he kept in a belt pouch out of the same stubborn habit that kept the whole rifle in service. "Got 40 more in reserve. After that, we're improvising." The next several minutes were the kind of ugly, chaotic fight that never looks the way training simulations promise it will. All noise and confusion, and the specific narrow tunnel vision focus of a man trying to make every one of a dwindling number of rounds count against an enemy who had, by this point, figured out exactly which threat in the gallery actually mattered and redirected accordingly. A slug caught Marcus across the outside of his upper arm on the 4th exchange. A graze that felt at first like a hard shove and then, half a second later, like someone had pressed a hot iron directly against the muscle, and he went down hard behind his overturned bench with blood already soaking through his sleeve, and a very clear, very professional understanding that the boarders had adjusted their fire pattern to force him to keep his head down raw. They then let him keep picking them off one at a time. "Raise is hit," someone called out, one of the other Earth auxiliary troopers, a private named Akafer who'd been carrying an energy carbine that had done exactly nothing useful all fight, and Marcus, teeth gritted against the burn in his arm, worked the bolt on his rifle one-handed and forced himself back up over the edge of the bench. "Raise is fine," he said, which was a lie, and sighted on the nearest boarder's shoulder and fired, and watched the man's arm come apart in a spray of shield light exactly the way the first 3 hits had. 4 down, 8 left, and the exchange had cost him 2 more rounds he hadn't meant to spend, leaving him with 1 in the chamber and 30-some in reserve, and a wound in his arm that was going to make working that bolt considerably harder with every passing minute. He forced himself to slow down, the way 6 years of long-range discipline had trained into him below the level of conscious thought. Don't spend a shot you're not certain of. Don't panic fire just because the position feels exposed. Breathe, track. Wait for the shot that actually counts instead of the shot that just feels satisfying to take. It was the same discipline that had once let him hold a position for 6 hours waiting for a single confirmed target to step into a 2-second window of exposure. And it was, he realized, exactly the skill nobody in the Alliance's energy weapon doctrine still trained for, because energy weapons didn't reward patience the way a bolt-action rifle with a 6-round magazine and a finite reserve absolutely did. He watched the boarder's movement pattern instead of just reacting to it, noticed, over the space of 2 more exchanges, that they advanced in staggered pairs, one covering while one moved, professional and disciplined in a way that confirmed his earlier read that these were mercenaries rather than opportunists, and noticed, more usefully, that each pair paused for almost exactly 2 seconds at the crest of the overturned consoles they were using for cover before committing to the next bound forward. A habit built for dodging plasma fire that gave a bolt-action marksman with a taste for patience exactly the kind of predictable window he needed. He put the next round through that 2-second window and took down a 5th boarder clean through the shielded chest plate, then worked the bolt again, sweat and blood mixing on his hands now, and did the math on what was left. 2 rounds in the internal magazine, 34 in the reserve box, 7 boarders still standing, and an arm wound that was going to slow his reload speed by a factor he didn't love thinking about. "Somebody get me a working comm," he called out over the chaos, "because if there's a bigger problem behind this ambush, I want to know about it before it shows up and finds me down to my last magazine." It was Doros Vale who answered that call, not with words but with his own body, moving before Marcus had even finished the sentence. Because the comm relay junction was mounted on the gallery's far wall, directly in the boarder's current line of advance, and getting to it meant crossing 8 meters of open deck that nobody wearing useless plasma-scattering armor should have survived crossing. Doros crossed it anyway, plasma carbine slung and forgotten, moving in a dead sprint with nothing but his own honor guard training and the specific desperate calculation of a man who had just watched his entire doctrine fail in front of his princess, and had decided, apparently, that being physically useful mattered more right now than being technologically correct. He took a glancing hit across the ribs that staggered him but didn't drop him, reached the junction, slammed the emergency comm override, and threw himself back behind cover a half-second before a follow-up shot would have taken his head off. "Fleet comm is live," he shouted, breathing hard, one hand pressed to his ribs. "Whatever you need broadcast, human, broadcast it now." Marcus stared at him for a beat longer than the situation strictly allowed, because 40 minutes ago this same alien had stood next to his princess laughing at an antique rifle, and now he just crossed open fire on nothing but stubborn will to buy a comm channel for the weapon he'd mocked, and there wasn't time to process what that meant except to be grateful for it and keep working. "This is Ray's, Earth Auxiliary, requesting immediate intel on this boarding party's origin and any follow-up assets inbound," he said into the comm, working the bolt on his rifle one-handed between words, arms screaming where the grays had gone from hot to a deep, insistent throb. "We've confirmed kinetic penetrators defeat their shield configuration. Repeat, kinetic rounds defeat the shielding. Energy weapons are not effective. Adjust any incoming response accordingly." The reply came back fast, clipped, and considerably more alarming than Mark Us had hoped for. "Rays, this is Fleet Ops. Sensors just picked up a Voss cartel corvette dropping out of stealth 200 kilometers off the shipyard's dark side. Configuration consistent with a boarding support vessel. If that ship's carrying a second wave with the same shield configuration, or worse, if it's carrying a heavier kinetic-resistant weapons platform meant to finish what this boarding party started, we are looking at losing the princess, this gallery, and potentially the shipyard itself within the next 15 minutes. Doros Vale, still pressing a hand to his ribs, looked at Marcus with an expression that had shed every last trace of the amusement from 40 minutes ago. 15 minutes, he said, and you have 34 rounds left for a rifle that just became the single most important weapon on this ship. 32, Marcus corrected, working the bolt again as a sixth boarder edged into view and paid for it with a shot through the visor. 6 down, 6 left in the room, one corvette full of God knows what 15 minutes out. Anybody got a plan that isn't just hope the ammo holds? Now would be a great time to mention it. The remaining 6 boarders didn't go down easy, and Marcus spent the next 4 minutes fighting the kind of fight that used up every scrap of the patience and discipline 6 years of marksmanship training had built into him. Because 32 rounds against 6 professionally trained mercenaries in shielded armor left exactly 0 margin for a wasted shot, and his arm had gone from throbbing to genuinely unreliable, forcing him to brace the bolt action against the edge of the overturned bench, just to work it fast enough between exchanges. He took down the 7th boarder with a shot that threaded between 2 support struts at a range of maybe 15 meters, the kind of shot that would have been trivial with an energy weapons targeting assist, and was, without one, exactly the kind of shot his grandfather's old training manuals had spent whole chapters teaching him to make on instinct alone. The 8th boarder got smart and stopped advancing, hunkering down behind cover and trying to wait Marcus out, which might have worked if Doros Vale, ribs cracked, one arm hanging awkward, but very much still in the fight, hadn't found a discarded slug thrower dropped by one of the fallen mercenaries, and started using the enemy's own kinetic weapon against the enemy's own shielded armor, proving in real time that the physics quirk Marcus had identified worked both directions and wasn't unique to his particular rifle. By the time the 12th and final boarder went down, Doros's borrowed slug thrower this time, not Marcus's rifle, the two of them having settled without discussing it into a rough covering rotation that let each reload, while the other kept pressure on. Marcus had 4 rounds left in his reserve box, a wound in his arm that had stopped being merely painful and started being genuinely concerning. And roughly 11 minutes left before whatever the Voss cartel corvette was carrying arrived to finish the job, the boarding party had started. "Report," Vexthala said, emerging from behind the retinue's protective huddle now that the immediate gunfire had stopped, mourning nothing of her earlier composure except the faint tremor in her voice that suggested the last several minutes had cost her something she wasn't used to having taken from her. 12 boarders down. What is inbound?" "A corvette, 200 kilometers off the shipyard's dark side," Doros said, still pressing a hand to his ribs. "Fleet Ops believes it may be carrying either a second boarding wave with matching shield configuration, or a heavier weapons platform designed to finish this operation from range if the boarding party failed." "Then we need to know which," Vexthala said, "and we need an answer faster than 11 minutes allows for guessing." Marcus, sitting against the overturned bench with his rifle across his knees and blood soaking steadily through his sleeve, found the shape of an idea starting to assemble itself out of the same stubborn, patient part of his brain that had spent the last 4 minutes tracking border movement patterns instead of just reacting to them. "If that corvette's carrying a heavier kinetic-resistant platform," he said, "it's not going to be firing anything small enough for a rifle to matter against. We're talking ship-scale ordnance at that point. But this shipyard's got point defense batteries all along its outer hull, doesn't it? Standard micrometeorite defense, mass driver cannons rated to intercept debris at orbital velocities." "They do," Vexthala said slowly, watching him with the same sharp, urgent attention she'd fixed on him during the firefight. "Though they are calibrated for debris interception, not ship-to-ship engagement, and their targeting doctrine assumes energy weapon countermeasures on any hostile approach, the same doctrine that Zeus T failed against this boarding party's shielding. Then somebody needs to recalibrate that doctrine in the next 10 minutes, Marcus said. The same way I just recalibrated mine, because if those point defense cannons are already kinetic mass drivers, they don't need new hardware to punch through Class 5 shielding. They just need someone to tell their targeting computer to stop trying to outthink the problem with fancy prediction algorithms built around energy weapon physics, and start trusting the dumbest, oldest math there is: mass, velocity, and a straight line.